All right, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Sorry for a little bit of delay. Started a little later, and then as I told Jim a little earlier, this is probably going to bite me beginning class tonight. So nonetheless, glad to be able to start. Glad to see everybody this evening. Those who have been away from us, we're glad you can be back with us. What's going on in life? Anything new? Prayer requests? Who do we need to keep in mind? Does anybody have anybody new that we need to add or have updates? Prayer report or praise report, either one. No?
Keep Holly in your prayers because we'll know tomorrow she sees the surgeon.
Okay.
How many trouble she's in, or maybe everything will be fixable.
I hope fixable. And or even a more hopeful stance, nothing that really needs to be fixed. It's already on its way being fixed. Okay. So continue praying for Holly Harris. Anyone else?
Tinsley and Cameron and Clear are home right now.
Okay.
Until the 14th or 15th. And they have to go back for a day or two, and then they get to come back for Christmas.
Okay. Cancel at home. Okay. Anybody else? Okay, we'll ask Lum if you will say a prayer for these, also in preparing our mind for Bible class as well.
Father, we thank you for the opportunity yet again to get open the Word, read from it, study it, hopefully, Father, that through this study it will help to reach our lives each day. We study and learn more from it. Pray, Father, that you be with this congregation. Only read and teach the truth that you have it done. And we can always learn to study your Word so that we can grow in our faith each day. We know we need to mature each day more and grow closer to you. Pray, Father, you be with those that are mentioned this evening that need a healing hand and have sickness, that you would hope to reach down to them in some way, that they can be lifted up and be that way or continue back to their normal walk of life. We pray, Father, for those that we're not mentioned as well that are sick, that we know of, and also need some healing so they can get back to their normal walk of life. We pray, Father, you be with us as we keep studying your Word and worshiping this congregation. Pray, Father, for each and every family here, that we can continue to be safe and be faithful in thy service. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, tonight we are continuing through the study of the book of Habakkuk. Last week we went through a general introduction, and tonight we're going to go through chapter 1. Now we'll also answer some of the questions, at least maybe the first 4 questions that are on that text evaluation of just trying to summarize what's going on in the text. And we'll start out with that, at least for our field focus tonight. And then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the text, really break open the text and wrestle with some of the, faith questions that come about from this text that you and I maybe resonate with today in a good way or maybe in a negative way. And Habakkuk's fighting that same battle as we go through this text. So some of the things to remember as we go through this text, the 2 main themes. We're dealing with the divine justice of God. Why does God allow some people, especially wicked nations, to overtake what we might consider to be a righteous nation? Or on an individual basis, why does God allow the wicked to run over the righteous? Does God not care? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit tonight. Also, there's the theme of faith during crisis? How do we respond to God's response or what we might deem a lack of response? And how do we wrestle with the concept that, maybe God's not going to deliver me from this, or maybe he chooses to deliver me from this? I don't know. There's some questionable things we find through Scripture, and by questionable meaning there are people who looked at how things played out and they said, look, if God does this, so be it. If he doesn't, so be it. I'll still trust God as God because he's God. So those are our two main themes: divine justice and also faith during crisis. Now our text this evening, we're focusing on chapter 1, verse 1 to the beginning of chapter 2. Some of these chapter divisions don't really map out very well, but basically we're going through Habakkuk's first question, we're going through God's first response, and then we're going through Habakkuk's response and second questions. Now, as we go through this text, let's read these sections, and then we'll break them down as to what the key things are stated in the text. If someone would like to read verses 1 through 4 for us, and then we'll break that down here in a second. In chapter 1, verse 1. Yeah, that was good. That was a good reading, testing it. Oh, I did? Okay, let's try chapter 1. Sorry, my bad. Let's do chapter 1, 1 through 4. Habakkuk.
The prophet did see, O Lord, how long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? Even cry unto thee of violence, and thou wilt not save. Why hast thou shown me iniquity, and caused me to be of grievance? For spoiling and violence are before me, and there are that raise up strife and contention. Therefore the law is slack, and judgment doth never go forth. For the wicked doth compass about the righteous, therefore wrong judgment proceedeth.
So as we go through these initial verses, I want you to note out, some of these are very straightforward. One of these we kind of have to think a little bit. But in verse 2, the initial question is, Lord, how long shall I cry and you will not hear? Lord, do you even hear me crying out? The prophet Habakkuk would say, and in fact, he would say in verse 3, Lord, it seems like you don't hear me. Why are you showing me grief? Why are you showing me wickedness? Why are you showing me this iniquity taking place in my life? And then in verse 4, he begins by talking about the violation of law and justice. It's almost as if the wicked prevail. And God, why is there no justice for the righteous? Why are the wicked why do they seem to continue on with this and there's no repercussions to their actions? All of those are valid questions. When you see wicked people, as we would say, getting away with stuff, and it's just like everything they do in life seems to flourish, and they have from a life living standard, they have a green thumb for life, and everything they do is just wonderful and beautiful. Well, Habakkuk has that problem, and we're going to see how God works with that problem in his response. So our three initial questions: Lord, do you hear my cry? Lord, why do you show me iniquity and grief in my life? And Lord, why is there no justice for the righteous? But then we go into God's first response. What is God going to do in response to this injustice? So beginning in verse 5, if someone would read verse 5 through 11.
Look among the nations and watch, be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days, which you would not believe, though it were told you. For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth, to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses are also swifter than leopards, and more fierce than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. They all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings and princes and scorn by them. They deride every stronghold, for they heap For they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. This his mind changes, and as he transgresses, he commits offense, ascribing this power to his God.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Lowercase God.
Oh, okay, yeah. So in this response, it's interesting. Verse 5, God says, okay, I'm going to give you a response to how I'm going to work with these wicked individuals who are repressing the righteous. I'm going to send a wicked nation to oppress the wicked in your own nation. In fact, if you notice some of the characteristics in verse 6, I'm raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places which are not theirs. They are both terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity, note this, proceed from themselves. You think Israel is unjust and the wicked are throwing down or oppressing the righteous. Just think about this Chaldean or Babylonian empire that's going to come through, and their decisions are basically made up of how they feel that day. That's a just society, don't we think so? In fact, noticing through this, look at where their judgment comes from. Verse 8, part of their judgment comes from their military forces. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than evening wolves. So they're just out on the prowl, about to attack their prey. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar, and they fly like the eagles that hasten to eat. In fact, God says not only is justice going to come by the hands of the Chaldeans, but notice where they attribute this praise toward in verse 10. Though his mind changes, he commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. Well, my God has told me that I need to take over Jerusalem. I need to take over Israel. I just need to lead Judah into captivity. That's a wonderful mentality. But really, behind the scenes, who's really pulling the strings? Capital G, God. God is pulling the strings. If God says he's preparing a nation to come take out his own people, guess what's about to happen? There's a nation coming in and about to take over God's people. Now, it's interesting if you compare this with the book of Jonah. And we talked about last week, one of the unique features of Habakkuk is it's the only book of prophecy that we have that's a dialogue between a prophet and God. And it's just strictly a dialogue. There's no story narrative behind it, unlike the book of Jonah, which includes a little bit of dialogue, but it's also a narrative as well. In Jonah's case, we find a couple of things that are prepared. There was a fish who was prepared for Jonah. There was a plant that was prepared for Jonah. There was a heat that was prepared as well. There was also a worm that was prepared to take down the plant. And we find from Jonah, we find all this disgust and angst towards people who are not God's people. In fact, the book of Jonah focuses on Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian nation. And God's sending a prophet to go to a foreign nation to try to save them. What kind of God would send his messenger to go save his enemies? Yeah. And you think about it in the ultimate scheme of things, what did Jesus do that Jonah didn't? Jesus willingly went where God asked him to go. In fact, it was those who claimed that they loved God the most were actually the enemies of the cross of Christ. And he was crucified in the very place where we might consider the homeland of the religion against Christianity. But you know, Christianity grew even though it was established at the heart of God's enemies. It's a beautiful story. Well, anyways, I say all that to say this. In the book of Jonah, we find quite a few things prepared. And in the ultimate sense, God had a messenger prepared for God's enemies to save them, and the one who was prepared to do that chose to flee and cower away and not do his responsibility duties. Habakkuk is a little different in that even though we don't see Habakkuk being thrown out into a specific nation, or in this case with God and his people, it's interesting how he wrestles with this because in his mind, like we talked about last week, Israel is this very prestigious, in this prestigious position of honor, where if you're God's people, surely God's going to make sure nothing bad ever happens to you. But there's a qualifier with that. In a sense, nothing eternally bad happens to you if you are what? obedient, faithful. That's the concept. We're not going to get to it tonight, but the key verse, the just shall live by faith, Habakkuk 2 and verse 4. That's key. If God has showed us what he expects of us, just like he did with the children of Israel in Deuteronomy, all through Deuteronomy, really Deuteronomy 30 and 34, he would say, look, there's going to come a time you're not going to listen and you're not going to obey. And then you're going to be asking questions, why aren't you following me? But, I mean, it was a problem within their own hearts. Yes.
What about Job? He had not answered God, and why was that punishment allowed?
Say that last part again.
Why was that punishment allowed?
Why was it allowed? We'll talk about it when we break down this first section a little bit, especially question number 2, because that deals with the problem of why does God permit certain sufferings as opposed to other people. That's a good question. We'll come back to that here in a moment. So the two things that God says. These people don't know their right God from their left, and justice is going to come from an unjust nation, which is interesting. Why would God allow that? We'll see that a little bit later on. And then we have our last section, verse 12 through chapter 2 and verse 1. I'll go ahead and read that. Habakkuk's second response begins with, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. Lord, you have appointed them for judgment, O rock. You have marked them for correction. You are of purer eyes than to behold evil and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Why do you make men like fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them? They take up all of them with a hook, they catch them in their net, and gather them in their dragnet. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Therefore they sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their dragnet, because by them their share is sumptuous and their food plentiful. Shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrected." When you look at the beginning of Habakkuk's response to God's statement, verse 12 and 13, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? In fact, Lord, if you've chosen to appoint them for judgment on your people, so be it." Habakkuk's first response is, "Lord, you know better than I do." But, and that's a big problem we have today, and we'll talk about that whenever we get to the breakdown of how we express that text today. But he also says, beginning in verse 13 and following, specifically if you look down in verse 13, the last part of verse 13, "Why do you deal treacherously, or why do you look on those who deal treacherously? Hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he." God, even when the Chaldeans come in, why are you going to allow a more wicked nation than your people? Why are you going to allow them to overtake your people? Well, the problem that we find through chapter 2 is God says Israel is not, in fact, more righteous than the Chaldeans. In fact, really in view, and I think, Brother Lum, you said something about this in times past, sometimes we tend to weigh certain sins in a higher degree, or more damning in a sense than others, when really in view of God's playing field, all sins are on an equal playing field. Now, we can get into specifics about that, but sin is sin. That's the concept. God begins by saying to Habakkuk in chapter 2, it's not about a more wicked nation. You're trying to itemize, well, you've got more sins than Sally Mae over here, so you deserve more punishment from God than Sally Mae does. And God should be a little lighter in his punishment towards Sally Mae. Says who? I need to understand the system of sin, of sacrifice, of sanctification, how that purification process comes about. And at the end of the day, you and I did not come up with that system. God did. In fact, if our response to God in any aspect of our faith and walk with him is anything less than what we find in verse 12, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God?" Does not God know more than you and I will ever know? So I'm going to trust his judgment when he makes certain decisions. Even if I don't quite get it, I trust that God's doing what's best. In fact, notice the next phrase after he makes that statement about God's eternal essence and knowledge. we shall not die. Your nation's not going to perish. Your people aren't going to perish. You're going to deliver them. You told us in times before, if we don't correct our wrongs, we're going into captivity. Even though we're going into captivity, God, I know you're there with me. It's of interest, Tuesday nights right now at the school, the ladies are studying the book of Esther, and it's been a fantastic study from what I've heard. But some of the things that Vicki will talk about whenever we're talking in the office, it always amazes her how whenever you're looking through the book of Esther and you're looking at Mordecai and you're looking at Esther's response and how they never mention God, but there's certain instances that point towards God, like the aspect of praying and the aspect of fasting. But who are they praying to? Who are they fasting for? What problems are going on? In fact, when you read Mordecai's statement in Esther chapter 4 to Esther, perhaps for a time like this, you've come to the kingdom to save these people, to save your people. In the grand scheme of things, Mordecai's saying in a roundabout way, God has prepared people in prepared places who are ready to glorify God and deliver his people, and even see within their own selves how strong and how courageous they really can be in glorifying God if they simply choose to do what God requires them to do. Sometimes it puts us in positions that make us a little anxious, sweat a little bit. And just like Esther would say, you know what? If I die, I die. But if I live, I live. Whatever happens, so be it. And she did exactly what God had designed her to do, even though we don't read anything about God. In the book of Habakkuk, what we find in view of Habakkuk's response, Lord, you're eternal, you know better than I do, but then why must the righteous suffer by the wicked? Now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the text, and if you're answering questions 2, 3, and 4, these are generally the answers to those. They don't have to be exactly this wordage, because I think I put on some of those summarized in your words what God is saying, but that's how I summarized it. So when we're examining the text in the first portion, we're dealing with 3 questions. Lord, do you hear my cry? Why do you show me iniquity and grief? Why is there no justice for the righteous? When we're expressing the text, maybe in our modern day faith, it may sound something more like this. Does God even hear me? Is he even listening to what's going on in my life? I've been pouring out my heart to him, and I've been throwing these tears out, and there's been all this pain, and all this angst, and all this anger, and this anxiety, and confusion, and I don't know. Does God hear me? It's a good question. We'll talk about that. The second question that we find is, why is God showing me this? You ever wonder why certain things happen in your life? Or why God has allowed certain things to happen in your life? There's a lot of answers for those things. To say we might be able to knock it down to a answer, that's not what I'm here for this evening, but I'll give you some principles of working towards trying to figure out why certain things happen or why God allows certain things as opposed to other things in life. So maybe you've asked the question, why is God showing me this? And then number 3, the last expression, why is there no justice for the righteous? Why are my problems still here? Why do my problems remain? God, why does it seem like you've not done anything towards these people? Now, or towards the wicked. Now, all of these are broken down in other texts of the Bible. I find it of interest when we look through the book of Psalms. Does God hear me? Oftentimes we read these cries of, I cry out into the night. Lord, do you even hear me? Even the psalmist brings out this perspective that maybe sometimes God's own people wonder if God's even listening. That's not uncommon. That's human nature. You ever felt yourself in a very transparent situation and it really did feel like you had no one and you were alone? Even if you had someone next to you, you still felt as if God's not doing anything about this. But that was what you thought. Scripture is not foreign to that concept where people cry out constantly, God, where are you? In fact, probably the most common text that we would use for this is Psalm 22:1. My God, why have you forsaken me? We're going to read a text when we break that down just a little bit where it says that though he cried, he was heard. interesting text, because normally we say God didn't hear anything. But we're looking at why is God showing me this. Job 14:1 would say, man born of woman is man born of woman is full of trouble. In fact, the book of James would say that life is but a vapor as it passes by. And it's interesting in Luke 2, verse 19, after we see the shepherds coming to Jesus, it would kind of say something that Mary had pondered these things in her heart. God, what does this mean? Well, oftentimes you've probably been reading through the biblical text, or you've been looking through your life and you've been asking God, what does this mean? I don't get it. I don't get it. God, point me in the right way. We'll talk about that here in a second. And then also, why do my problems remain? I do want to look at some of these texts, at least the first two. Job 23, verse 12. Whoever gets there first, if you'd like to read that for us. Job chapter 23 and verse 12.
Neither have I gone back from the commandment of his lips. I've esteemed the words of his mouth more than my necessary food.
Read verse 12 as well, or 13 as well, sorry.
But he is in one mind, and who can turn him? And what his soul desireth, even that he doeth.
So, why would it seem to be the case that, Lord, my heart is poured out towards you, it's longing for you, but why does it seem like things are just the way that they are? Those are good questions. In fact, look over at Psalm chapter 66, verses 10 through 12. Psalm 66, 10 through 12. And same thing, whoever gets there first, go ahead and read that for us.
Thou, O God, hast proved us. Thou hast tried us as silver is tried. Thou broughtest us into the net. Thou laidest affliction upon our bellies. Thou hast caused me to ride over our heads. We went through fire, through water, but thou broughtest out into a rolling place. Now, where did you say that?
To 12. Now, I want you to notice in verse 10 and verse 11, God, you've tested us, you've refined us, you brought us into nets, you've laid us into affliction. The beginning of verse 12, you caused men to ride over our heads. We went through fire and through water, but notice where all of that led to. You have brought us into a better place. My rendering, I got New King James, it would say you brought us out to rich fulfillment. That idea of rich is a place of abundance. We talked about Psalm 23 just very briefly on Sunday evening, but the idea that he makes me to lie down in green pasture, he leads me beside the still waters. He prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemy, and my cup flows over. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. And where does he say he's going to stay all of his life? The house of the Lord forever, forever. The concept of some of the trials that we go through, we may not understand where exactly that's going to lead, but just like Habakkuk would say, Lord, you're everlasting, you know better. We're not going to perish from this. Now, in human sense, Habakkuk may actually die while the captivity is going on, but it doesn't mean that God has utterly forsaken his people. Even in captivity, think about all the ways that we find through the Babylonian Empire, we find how God took care of Daniel and his comrades, and even all those others who were taken into captivity. We find with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we find that they were 10 times wiser than all of the sorcerers, of all of the wise men, of all the philosophers in Babylon. If God can do that when I'm in a foreign place, far away from home, what do you think God can do when I'm in my home? I think he can do much good in my life. I think he can make me better than where I am right now. And all of that deals with, sometimes I've got to look at the process. I may not understand why, but I've got to look at the process. Whatever God has allowed to happen in my life. Now, there's some stipulation with this, and we'll talk about it when we get to it. And it's almost like the beginning of what we talked about with our Obadiah study. Conflicts happen in our lives. Sometimes they happen because of our own doings. Sometimes conflict happened and we didn't cause any of it. It's stuff happening to us. Like you were asking about Job. Why did God allow some of those things? Well, we'll look at that when we get to it. But God had, at least we find an initial statement, like we read from Job 23, 12, and 13. If God chose to test Job in that way, let's think in a long-term stance. What did God see in Job that he didn't see in anybody else that God allowed Job to go through that? Faithfulness. In fact, in the very beginning, God would ask Satan, have you considered my servant, Job? Do you know that God's going to offer you and I as a testing grounds for Satan to try to get us to fail? We ever considered that? And what happens if we prevail from that? Blessings. Blessings. That's what it was. Terrible what happened to it. And for someone to turn around and say, well, God, why would you? Well, that's the concept. How can the servant of God work through what we might deem unfair situations in life? Why would God allow those things? Well, it's probably because God trusts us and he knows that we can make it through that. We may not have all the answers. In fact, you look at Job 38, 39, 40, 41, and that whole conversation between God and Job begins with this: who is this who darkens counsel without knowledge? If I really want to know why certain things happen in my life, I may want to look into different texts as to how certain people resonated with the things that happened in their life. Now, when we get to that third question, we'll dive more into that. But just as James 1 would say, the trying of your faith produces patience. Therefore, let patience have her perfect work. Sometimes we just see trials as a on and off switch. They're either there or they're not. Where it's happening, where it's done. But that's not how problems work. In fact, it works like a dimmer switch. It gets sometimes worse and worse and worse and worse, but then it gets better and it gets better. And then finally it's done. Sometimes it might be literally light on and, oh, okay, I didn't have a transition period with that. But there's something common within trials. Endurance through those trials. In fact, we would read in verse 12 that blessed is those who endures, for when he is tried and found worthy, he shall receive a crown of righteousness, which God has prepared for those who overcome. We've got to keep in mind, though we may not understand necessarily why specific things happen, Habakkuk understood, even Joseph understood, you meant evil for these things, but God meant for good. Now think of it in the ultimate sense. If we were to talk to Jesus today, and we were to ask him, Jesus, what do you think the Father really had in mind? When you had all those wicked individuals, you had some of your disciples through there, do you think the Father really had full control over the situation? I think Jesus would say the same thing. You know, you meant for evil, but God meant it for good. In fact, the ultimate good of all things. What's interesting is you find in some of those exemplary examples of faith, you find this understanding, or, even with it gives the persona of this understanding. Maybe they're still working through the thing, and maybe like it's a Peter with Cornelius thing. Of a truth, I perceive that God's not a respecter of persons. Maybe they're still putting the pieces together. But maybe if we were to look at some of those iconic figures of faith who said, you know what, if God meant it to happen this way, so be it. And if he didn't, I still trust God. It's interesting when you look at Mary's perspective. Lord, do so to your maidservant as you deem fit. Even Elizabeth said the same thing. I would love to have met that family, because some of the ladies in that family have some of the craziest views of faith that I really wish I had some days. You know what? If God sees fit for this to happen to me, praise be to God that he's counted me worthy to live life in this way. We don't think that way. So it's a challenge to our faith in a multiplicity of ways. In one sense, understanding I've got to accept, okay, these things are happening. And I've got to look into what I can control and what I can't control. But I do know this. There is one who is in control over the whole process of it, and that's God. And whether or not I commit myself to acknowledge, well, maybe God does know best. Not maybe. God does know best. If I were to look at it from that perspective, and then be able to look at what God has done for all of his people in times past, what makes me think that God still doesn't care about his children today. In fact, that goes into the first evaluation question. We're going to pick back up on this, Lord willing, next week. We're not going to get through this. But in view of response, God's response in times of crisis, does God hear me? Well, the Bible tells us in a multiplicity of places. This is only a few passages, but I made mention Psalm 22, verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? It would say in verse 24 of that same text that though he seemed forsaken, God heard him. Actually, I believe in that text, it actually uses a personal pronoun. Let me look that up and verify that for you. Okay, so he uses a second person or a third person pronoun. He has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has he hidden his face from him. But he cried to him. When he cried to him, he heard. That's interesting. When the Son cried to the Father, there was no forsaking. In fact, God was watching that whole process take place. Very interesting. In view of the righteous, I need to remember that even in my times of crisis, even when it seems like, well, think of it this way. Do you hear the word crisis in the word of crucifixion? Maybe in a very loose way. I know I don't hear the word crisis, but when you're being crucified, yeah, that's not a very pleasant word. It's called crisis for a reason. Someone's crying. It's in the word. There are audible moans and wailing coming from this process, but God still hears this. In fact, it's interesting if you look over in Exodus chapter 2 at the end of the text, and in the middle of chapter 3, when God would say, He has heard the cries of His people, He has seen their affliction, He knows their sorrows, and He's coming down or sending someone to bring His people up out of their afflictions into a better land. That's the story of Christ in salvation to mankind. He's heard our cries from our biggest despairs. He has brought down a wonderful gift to deliver and bring up His people out of captivity into a better land. That's Christ. That's Christ in the ultimate sense. So I need to acknowledge when I'm dealing with the crisis of my faith, God does hear the righteous individuals. And it's of interest if you look at Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 7, when it's talking about the crisis that Christ went through. It would say whenever he was fighting through, I guess we'll begin in verse 5. It would say, though Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, you are my son, and today I've begotten you. Also he said in another place, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, who in the days of his flesh, when he offered up prayers and supplication with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. Notice why he was heard. He was heard because of his godly fear. And though he was a son, yet he learned obedience through the things which he suffered. And notice verse 9, what does suffering produce? Produces a more perfect individual. In fact, it would say, and having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation. I have a question. Was Jesus perfect while he was here on earth? Well, this text tells me that he wasn't quite perfect yet. The point of that, now he was perfect. He was sinless. Don't get me wrong. That's not what this text is talking about. It's saying when he fulfilled the ultimate design of his mission, God perfected the very mission that he sent his son for. What do you think could happen in your life and my life if we were to commit ourselves to God in, notice the middle of verse 7, in the moments that cause us to have vehement, very strong, audible cries? Maybe you're not an audible crier. Maybe you're an internal crier, and you get that I don't know how the sorrow emotion that basically knocks the air out of you, knocks you to your knees, and you can't get up. Maybe that's how you express your sorrow. I don't know. But it would say that when Jesus was at his most painful moment in life, and don't think of it as a one-time thing, most painful moments of life, and even tears, cried to him who was able to save him from death. It would say God heard him. Now, if God will do that to a person who is trying their utmost best to love God, to serve God, and they're trying at every opportunity they can to continue being obedient to Him, even on days where I have those vehement cries and those tears, I know God hears me, even if I, like Paul, have the mentality that, Lord, I'm not worthy, but Lord, I really do need your help. That's the kind of faith you and I have to have. Habakkuk had that faith. Now, what's interesting is when we look at who God does not hear. This is our last focus for tonight. In Proverbs chapter 15, verse 29, it's of interest. When you look over at John 9, verse 31, we normally use this text where the man who was blind and he was healed, he would say to the Pharisees, or really the Jewish leaders there, we know that God heareth not sinners. That comes from Proverbs 15 and verse 29. In fact, it makes a distinction between the wicked and the righteous. It would say the Lord is far from the wicked, but he hears the prayer of the righteous. Now I have a question. And this sometimes hurts people's feelings, but in reality, let's work with the logic of this. Will God hear my prayer if I choose to go steal a car, never return it, and say I'm sorry? Will God hear my prayer if I never make amends for that sin? True repentance is I put that car back. That's repentant. You put it back. Even if you wreck it, you gotta pay the money for it. There's a consequence to those actions. In view of worship, if I choose to worship God incorrectly, is that a sin? Is it still a sin if I ignorantly worship Him incorrectly? So what if there's people in denominationalism who are worshiping and saying this is a family tradition, we've always done this, I've always been a Baptist or a Methodist or a Presbyterian for so long, and this, I know it's right, I have this feeling in my heart. Does God overlook that sin? Okay, now the terrifying factor comes in this. If we know it's wrong, and we choose not to say anything about it or try to help these people to understand God is not hearing anything you're doing. These are the people who normally outpray us in view of we'll pray for you. These are the people who normally outgive us. These are the people who out-community service us. These are the people who outdo us in so many different ways, but they can never outdo us in this one regard. We have God. You can't outdo God. But they don't know that. They don't identify that. That's a problem. In fact, in view of the individual who realizes what you're doing is wrong, what's the responsibility, as Paul would say in 2 Corinthians 5? Since Christ died for all, we deem that all were what? Dead in sin. Therefore, we as ambassadors of Christ are begging to you, be reconciled to God. We have that obligation to go forth and try to help these people to see what you're doing is wrong. And God's not accepting any of it. That's a problem. Now, when you present that problem to people, normally they end up getting very angry and they don't want to talk to you anymore. So maybe the first thing you may not want to say to them is, you know, the way you're worshiping is wrong. I find that very blunt approach very few times through Scripture, and it depended on the individual who I was talking, or who I'd be talking to. It really would depend on the individual whether or not I choose that approach. I might want to start more with, you know that verse where it says God doesn't hear sinners? How do we know who's a sinner and who's not? And maybe work through the different realms of what qualifies as sinful. If I kill someone or murder someone, not all killings unjustified, it depends on the context. But murder, if I murder someone, is that sin? You can go through different kinds of sins. Well, what if I worship God incorrectly? Is that a sin? Don't you think it'd be important if we were to know what God requires for you and I to do, to worship Him? And if I choose to ignore that, Because note this, not only are we held accountable for what we know, we're also held accountable for what we hear and what we put in our mind. And don't think just because I told Uncle Jim back there, sorry, I can't think of another name, sorry, Uncle Jim back there that what he's doing wrong like 15, 20 years back, don't think Uncle Jim remembers that 20 years down the road. Be a constant reminder, be a godly reminder to them with love and consistency, devotion to them. We care about their soul, but we also realize that God does hear us. Why not work with other people as if He actually does hear us? What would that look like? Next week, Lord willing, we'll continue with this, and we'll actually pick up on question number 2, God's revelation of crisis in my life. Why does God allow certain things to take place in my life? And then we'll actually dive more into your Job question next week as well.
God prayed, Cornelius prayed to God when he was a Christian.
Say that again.
Cornelius prayed to God. God heard his prayer
Correct.
before he became a Christian. I said, God does hear prayer. Of course, he worships God in the way he taught his life. And the way he taught, he really hadn't done everything he needed to do.
That is correct. There's a distinction. So when we look at the Proverbs 15:29, God is far from the wicked. In order for me to be identified as wicked as someone who is not seeking God at all, and I'm just living however I want to. With Cornelius, it would call him a just man, an honorable man. In fact, it would say that your prayers and alms have come before God. That'd be impossible if, in a sense, Cornelius had not been trying his best to live righteous as best as he knew under the old law until Peter came in, and then it would say, I've invited my friends and families that you must teach us what we must do and hear the words of God. So in that sense, God does hear the prayer or the heart of the individual who is seeking after God, striving after God. And like Acts 8 is a key example along with Acts 10 with Peter and Cornelius. Those who are seeking the truth, God will always put a truth seeker and a truth dispenser together. God will always make sure those who want to do what's right, He'll always make sure they have an avenue to obey. So in that case, we're not seeing necessarily a sinner in the sense of wickedness. We are seeing one who hasn't received salvation under the law of Christ yet, though. But he was trying to do the best that he could with what he knew. So that goes into a whole nother realm of that discussion. But you're right. That's a text people will use, all sinners are sinners. And then they'll use Cornelius as an example of that, but that's not what the Bible calls him. So.
I was going to say that the angel came into God and heard his prayers, and that he had God knew of the good things that he had done.
Mm-hmm.
God knew that he was doing good, giving, and worshiping God, and he was seeking Him. I mean, a different situation.
Yeah, that's one of those different situations.
Put people in categories outside the church that may be in Cornelius' situation.
That's true. Because since the gospel's been revealed, and as Paul would say multiple times through Colossians, it's gone into all the world. That kind of scenario is not happening. We're not still waiting for the Gentiles to be grafted in. That's already happened. So now God calls all men everywhere to repent, is what we're under today. That's a good point. Okay, any other thoughts?
I just often wondered, people who go to Baptist churches, these other denominational churches, they have their Bible in front of them. They read and study their Bible. Why do they not come and understand their Bible in such a way to know that they're wrong? Is everybody just...
I think that varies on the individual, and I'll say it this way. There's a really good example from bulletins. The reason I say bulletins, you can put something in the bulletin. It will be available for months upon months upon months, and it will be in the bulletin. Just because it's in there doesn't mean people read it. So in one regard, it simply could just be they're not reading. But at the same time, what if they're reading, but they're not understanding? and they're kind of stuck in an Ethiopian eunuch phase. How can I unless one guides me? And the one who is guiding them is not guiding them correctly. So there's probably more answers to that, but to narrow it down to one concept, I don't know. Okay, good thoughts. Calvin, can you stop that live stream thing there? We'll be back here in 1 minute.
You have a sign.
6:55.
6:55. Okay, 655 will be the song of invitation here in a moment. 655. Have you ever thought about your response to Jesus? I mean, have you thought about who he is, his personality? You know, oftentimes we put him on the plane of this super ethereal, angel-like being who's got this glowing background behind him and maybe a little halo or something like that. That's a little fantasizing of who Jesus was. He would look like a normal human being just like you and I. In fact, the prophet Isaiah would say in Isaiah 53, there's no beauty that we should desire him. He was a common-looking person, just like you and I, which is very interesting because when we start looking in the New Testament as to after people listen to Jesus, rather than just looking at Jesus, but looking into his heart and into his character. It's interesting some of the things that we would hear, especially in John chapter 7. There were some officers who were sent to go pick up Jesus and take him into prison. And in fact, he would say in verse 45, the officers, after listening to him, came to the chief priests and the Pharisees, who said to him, "Why have you not brought him?" And the officer said, "No man ever spoke like this man." Well, the leaders didn't like that. In fact, their response was, "Are you also deceived? Have any of the rulers of the Pharisees believed in him? But this crowd that does not know the law is accursed." You know, you just asked the question about why do people have a Bible and they don't get it, don't understand. We know one of the reasons that maybe some people don't get it, like we find from these religious leaders, sometimes I just believe in it because other people believe in it, but I don't actually believe in it myself. What I mean by that is your faith your faith? Or is your faith being borrowed from your parents, or your spouse, or your brother, or your sister? What's the source of your faith? In fact, in that phrase, your faith belongs to you. It's possessive faith. That is something you build and that you grow on. These officers, these soldiers, these trained warriors, they're already trained to listen to orders, to listen carefully, to dictate what's fair and what's not fair. And they come back to these rulers and say, "No man ever spoke like this." The question I have for you this evening is, if Jesus were in front of you tonight, would you say the same thing these men did? I'm not saying your faith is their faith, but if you've ever talked to anybody else who's read the sayings and the teachings of Jesus, you know what the ultimate conclusion of that is? No man ever spake like Jesus. Or the centurion, some people consider Cornelius an interesting study, but the centurion under the cross of Christ would pierce the side of Jesus. And he would see water coming out along with blood, and there would be a couple of different renderings depending on which gospel you're reading, but it would say, "Surely this was a righteous man." I think Luke's text would say, "Surely this was a perfect man." One text would say, "Surely this was the Son of God." And truly this man was just. You know, that's interesting, because if we look at the perspective of how people looked at Jesus, the question for you and I is, how do we see Jesus? Do you see him just like everybody else? He's got his way and you've got yours, and you'll just settle and agree with what's going on? Or is there something interesting about Jesus' way that you'd really like to know more about? It is true, but I would want you to investigate. No man ever spake like Jesus. No man ever gave his life like Jesus gave his life. No man ever lived a perfect life in view of the law, in view of what God required. In fact, it's the very example that you and I are striving to be like today. Peter would say in 1 Peter chapter 2 that Christ has left for us an example to follow. He's opened a new way, a new passage, a new fountain, so to speak. Something that can give us more than just this rejuvenation within this life, but rejuvenation eternally for the life to come. So who's Jesus to you? Maybe you're a child of God and you just see Jesus as another individual, not as Lord, not as God. You just see him as another person. It's not right. Maybe you're not a child of God and you'd like to know more about this Jesus. Maybe you know he came and died for you and you need to believe in him. Maybe you know that since he came and died for you, his blood was shed on Calvary, and you're being held accountable for your sins. You need to repent of those. Maybe you realize the forgiveness provided on Calvary's cross as he entered once into the most holy place when he sat down on the majesty on high. Maybe you realize you need to confess him as Lord and God because God has made him both Lord and God. Maybe this evening you'd like to become a child of God through the avenue of baptism. Whatever your need might be, the fountains are open. If you need forgiveness this evening, please come forward. Together we sing. We sing.
There's a fountain free, 'tis for you and me. Let us haste, so haste to it free. 'Tis the fountain of love from the source above, and he bids us all freely drink. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? 'Tis for you and me. Thirsty soul, hear the welcome call. 'Tis a fountain open for all. There's a living stream with a crystal link from the throne of life. Now it flows. While the waters roll, let the weary soul hear them call that more freely goes. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? 'Tis for you and me. Thirsty soul, hear the welcome call. 'Tis a fountain open for all. There's a rock that's left, and the soul is left, that may not its pure water share. 'Tis for you and me, and the stream I see. Let us hasten joyfully there. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? 'Tis for you and me. Thirsty soul, hear the welcome call. 'Tis a fountain open for all. I'd like to ask Philip Ponder to lead us in prayer in just a moment. Is there anything we need to announce? Good to see everyone here. All right. Nothing else? So bow together, please.
Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. Thank you for the opportunity we have to come here this evening and study a portion of the word. We ask you, Father, to be with those that you've taken up here tonight that are not there. Be with the ones that are watching over there and working with you. And use their skills and knowledge to bring back their faith. We ask you, Father, to be with the church here in Rogersville, be with the elders and the preachers, all the neighbors, pray we all work together to go out in the community and so much for your Son, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, coming there and dying on the cross for our sins. And we always remember that and keep it in our heart. We ask you, Father, to go with us through this week. Drag down, protect the children, run us back to next week. It's time to ask, Christ,
Run.
Watch you from the newspapers.
No, I'm not.
I'm still doing it. It's not ready. Used to, when I was, used to wear my shoes.
Don't say it.
And at that point.
You don't want to be here.
And I was like, what's wrong? He's like, now that it's that moment, that's it. I don't know what I'm complaining about.
But anyhow. He was actually where I am.
They probably have better food there.
I was like, because I just started doing it, it's still on these ones.
Yeah, this will be.
Yeah, yours got the part of
You're not.
I'll take it. I'll take it. Jackie, is that thing up there? It's rolls of saliva and all that.
It's not a thing, it's a chemical.
Chemical. Polymers.
Yeah, like this morning, as soon as I saw it raining, I immediately took it to the brook. I was like, no, I'm not doing it.
Well, I was like, probably not too good.
But how are they doing?
Someday it's like,
Yeah.
English might not like her voice or something, you know, it's just one of those. Yeah, yeah. Did he? So she's all right there with her by herself, yeah. And it's every day. Oh, same spot. I'm gonna get sore. Yeah, oh yeah. Instead of putting the cord in underneath the, yeah. Just pick line. It's not for a long time. It's, yeah, it's not good for a long time. Yeah, flush out, yeah.
You're gonna be off Sunday, right? Yeah.
Some of you, these days, go to work every day. And the black bud, must be white. He drives somebody. I mean, heard he drives. They're working a little bit on it now. It's people up here, neighbors, one of these now. Been over it, they've been at it for 15 months maybe, or
Yeah, it's going on 2 years.
and I never know. Last year, I met him about this time last year, David Scott. Talked to him in December, but he'd been before that. Hey, boy, go down there.
Yeah.
Survey market. He said, yeah, they're gonna survey. It's no, he wasn't going to. But he agreed to come. Got one of those three back, all the boxes. I think it's 43 survey. I live in Georgia.
The triple chance that it's still a process. That criminal flag. Three strikes, right? Until they didn't move it over.
So there was no survey. Yeah, survey is expensive. You didn't think that was
I did, that's what I thought about. And, I probably would drop it further.
you don't want to get fixed. You got programmers that can get fixed.
Pretty good guy.
He's cheap. Hey,
My buddy was cost to go to court with next minute.
Come on.
that's not Merle Williams. That's
Yeah.
It's for his day. That's his kind of country now.
Bottles, so they come.
Yeah, he works for the company. I think he's his name. He's all right. And one guy, I think True, she was like her last name. He lives up in the Florida Springs. He did a lot of sweat work in the mountain. Your county. Well, he knows how to do that way. They say he's pretty good. That's the name of his name on there. Which he still lives. You go down there, Florida Springs, it's one of them, there's a long driveway off to the left. You see his house.
I think that is, which David, I guess Tom did his son. I was watching it on the land.
Yeah.
I know that he knew.
Yeah, I know that. But they're good